Good evening from me. Left a pause there while I took a sip. It's great to be with you, great to be back. I've been away for a week. I've been away skiing, I know, poor me. I've been speaking on a Christian ski holiday. If you've never heard of Gold Hill Holidays, I'm going to give a plug for them now. If you've never heard of Gold Hill Holidays, Google them. There's a family from our church, and they're on a Christian travel company, holiday company, and they are fantastic. I've just been away with them skiing for a week. They do walking holidays, they do tours of the Holy Lands, they do all sorts of different things, and they are great, so check them out. But while I was skiing, I had a great week. I also had a bit of an accident one day. I ended up falling and landing on my ski, and it sliced me open a little bit, and I had to go to the hospital and sort things out. I'll tell you what, if the hospital visit I went to was anything to go by, Swiss efficiency is no myth. In and out within an hour, 5 stitches, it was amazing. Anyway, why am I telling that story? When I was up on the mountain, and I fell and I'd hurt my leg, the group of people who I was with, who were all 48 hours earlier, complete strangers to me, suddenly kicked into action. Everyone had a role to play. Everyone realised I was a little bit injured, and everyone did something. One person started to help sort of clean out the wound with a bit of water. One person who was a doctor sort of started bandaging me up and getting it together. One person got some paracetamol out for me. One person got a bottle of water out for me. One person gave me a lollipop. It was amazing. One person, at my request, started taking pictures of the wound because I knew my mum would want to see it. And everyone did something. And it was this wonderful moment where there was a sense of common purpose and something that needed to be done. Just minutes earlier, everyone had been focusing very much on their own skiing. They were there on a lesson to try and get better at skiing, and so obviously I needed a lesson to get better at skiing. But we'd been going, and they were very focused on their own thing, trying to get their turns right and trying to do everything properly, and very focused in on what they were doing. But as soon as there was something that as a group needed to be done, everyone had a common purpose. I was having another chat with someone who was there, who was a parent, who was there with their 2 teenagers and their wife, and he was saying that normally everyone getting out of the door on a normal weekday morning is a bit of a challenge. But when they were going for a ski together, everyone was up, everyone was ready, everyone wanted to be out of the door because there was something they wanted to do together. When there's a common purpose, it looks like something. When a group of people are united around something, things happen. And over the last few weeks in these gatherings, in these fresh gatherings, we've been thinking about what a community of grace looks like. What does it mean for us as a church, for us as the church in the world, to be a community of grace, to be shaped by it, to be fashioned by it? This thing of grace, of God's unearned, undeserved love poured out on us, given to us freely. The words we've sung, that we stand amazed, we stand in wonder at the cross, at that act of love and generosity on God's part. What does grace look like? What does a community fashioned and shaped by grace look like? We've been exploring different facets of that. And tonight, I want to explore the idea that a community of grace is loving. A community of grace, if we're shaped by grace, if we're captured by grace, it will outflow from us in love. We will be loving towards one another and towards the world around us. I want to look at 3 very simple verses in Romans chapter 13. If you have a Bible with you, I'd encourage you to open it or get an app out on your phone. If you'd like a Bible, wave your hand. Some of the welcome team are coming round now with Bibles. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Guy. Do put your hand up and they can get it for you. Romans chapter 13, verses 8 to 10, I want to read. Paul has been writing to a group of Christians, helping them, in this section of the letter, helping them to work out what it might look like to live as Christians in the world that they lived in, answering some questions they might have had. And he's just talked about how they're meant to relate to the authorities who are over them. He's just talked about the fact that they should obey the authorities over them. They should submit to them. And he finishes that in verse 7 of Romans 13 by saying, pay to all what is due them. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honour to whom honour is due. He's basically saying, if you owe something to someone, give it to them. If that's money, if that's taxes, if that's respect, give it to them. Don't be people who hold back something that should be given to someone else. But then he takes it way further, and he talks about another debt, another kind of debt that people might have. In Romans chapter 13, starting at verse 8, he says, "Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, love your neighbour as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbour, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." Father, as we examine these words, would you speak to us? As we remind ourselves of what you've done and the people that you've called us to be as a result, would you speak to us? Would you shape us? Would you once again give us an encounter with your grace? And would you make us a loving people? Not people who force love or fake love, but people who are fashioned and have love flowing from us. Please do that in us tonight, I pray. Amen. So Paul is saying that we should have no debts except a debt of love. The debt we owe, and the debt which will never be paid, it's a debt that we will always have, is to love one another. Why? What does that mean? Why do we have that debt of love? Well, Paul goes on to talk about it in terms of the law. The law being a set of principles and rules and instructions given to God's people way back near the beginning of the Old Testament. And he talks about some of those laws. He talks about the law not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to covet. They're part of the Ten Commandments. And they're some of the Ten Commandments that look sort of sideways towards our relationships with other people. It doesn't include the parts of the Ten Commandments that are looking upwards towards our relationship with God. He's focusing on our relationships with others at this point. And he's saying they can all be summed up in this command to love your neighbour. It's a direct quote from Jesus. Jesus said the same sort of thing, and he explained that your neighbour isn't just the other people of God. It isn't just the community of faith. When Paul is saying to love your neighbour, he's not just talking about us loving one another in the church. He's talking about us loving people. Loving one another, yes, but also loving the world, having an attitude of love towards everyone we meet. That's what loving your neighbour means. So why does Paul connect this idea of love and this idea of the law? We have to think for a moment about what the law was designed to do. What were those laws designed to do? Those laws of don't covet and don't murder and don't steal and don't commit adultery. These laws that can be summed up by love one another, love your neighbour. It's almost as if the law, these instructions that they were to follow, was meant to bring love out of them. That they should act towards one another with love, and if they're doing that, then it will look like not killing one another, not stealing from one another, not being jealous of one another and wanting each other's things. The problem, though, is that just being told do these things because it's what being loving looks like doesn't actually work. And it didn't work. The law didn't do that. The law didn't make people loving by trying to tell them this is what being loving looks like. The law actually did, in some ways, the opposite. The law highlighted the fact that people weren't loving. Because if the command is don't covet or don't be jealous of someone else's stuff, because if you're doing that, then you're not being loving, then as soon as we know that that's the command and that's the mark, well, I fail on that. And the people of Israel failed on that, and all of us fail on that. None of us can keep those commands. Why? Because deep down we're not loving, first and foremost. Deep down we are selfish. There's something inward focused about ourselves, not outward focused about ourselves. You can't create a loving person by telling them to behave like someone who's loving. Love has to come from within, not from without. So that's what the law had done. It exposed, it revealed the fact that we're not a loving people. So what did God do about that? Well, we know obviously that when Jesus came, he did act with love. He did fulfill that law. He was the perfect person of love. He did fulfill all of the law's requirements. He did keep these commandments. He lived that life of love. But so he did what our selfishness stops us from being able to do. He was love. He is love, and we benefited from that. Because, of course, he did that. And he could have taken all of the reward for that. He could have taken all of the status and the glory and the claim from that, but instead he gives that to us. That's what we've been singing about so far in our service. May I never lose the wonder of the cross. The cross which speaks of God's love and grace towards us. The cross which speaks of the fact that Jesus was willing to die in my place. He was willing to die the death that me, the selfish person, the inward-focused person, should die, so that I can receive everything that he, the person of love, the person who was outward-focused, the person who loved his neighbor perfectly, should have. That's what this grace thing is all about. This community of grace that we find ourselves part of is God's doing. It's his initiative. He has made it because he has acted with grace, with unearned love and mercy towards us. That's why we're thinking about being a community of grace. But where does this relationship between the law and love and grace go next? So far we've seen that the law shows us what a loving life looks like and also highlights our inability to have it and to live it. Jesus fulfilled it perfectly and gives us all of the benefits from doing so. And in response, what does Jesus ask us to do? In John's Gospel, shortly before Jesus is wrongly accused and wrongly killed, he says to his disciples, and so to them, through them to us, a new command I give you, that you love one another. He's saying, I'm giving you a new command. Love one another as I have loved you. So the law exposes that we can't be loving by ourselves. There's something in us that doesn't do that. Jesus does it for us, and he gives us all the benefits. And then he asks us again to be loving, to be people who live a new life, one marked by love. But I have a question. This command, this statement by Jesus, a new command I give you, that you love one another. How is it a new command? How is it anything different from what the law was always saying? Because if Paul can say, and if Jesus himself can say that the law can be summarized by love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. If that's the summary of the law, then how is love one another a new command? It's just the same old commandment given in a different way with different language. How's it new? Well, in some ways it's not new. But in other ways, it very much is. Because in the Old Testament, when the law was given through Moses, people weren't ready for simply love one another. They weren't ready for that. They weren't able to say, okay, yeah, we'll love one another. And then that will flow out through not murdering and not stealing and not doing all those things. If they'd just been told, love one another, it was too high a bar. It was too great a call. It was too difficult a task. Why isn't it now? Because Jesus doesn't just say, love one another. He says, love one another as I have loved you. His love for us makes us, or can make us, able to love properly. Jesus wasn't just following rules. When he says, love one another as I have loved you, he's not saying, follow the rules as I have followed the rules. He's saying, have in you the same love that I have in me and that flows out towards other people. This is no longer a rule-following love. This is no longer a commandment-dependent love. This is a love that comes from somewhere within, because in that same passage where Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you, he promises the Spirit. He says, I will send another, a paraclete, someone to come alongside, someone to live within you. I'll send you a new counselor. And that's how we can love. That's how we can have this love that doesn't just come through faking it, that doesn't come through pretending to be a loving people and hoping that the love will follow. It comes from within. It comes from the Spirit of love living within us. Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit being love, joy, peace, and so on. It's something that God does in us. It's something that's made possible. That wasn't possible when the law was given. The Spirit didn't dwell in people when the law was given. Jesus hadn't died for the people when the law was given. We're in a different time. It's in a different time within history, and so it can be possible for us. Once we have experienced the fullness of God's grace at the cross, then we can evidence the fullness of God's love towards one another and towards this world. That's why Paul, coming back to Romans 13, talks about it as a debt of love. The fact that we owe love. It's our response to Jesus. We don't love people so that Jesus will love us. We love Jesus because Jesus has loved us first. It's a response to what Jesus has done. Love is a response to grace. What does love look like, though? It's all very well to talk about a love that springs out, that's birthed within us. That's where we need to focus. If you feel as though you're not a loving person, the response to that shouldn't be, okay, well, let me learn what love looks like so I can do those things and then I'll become loving. The response should be, Lord, give me a new encounter of your grace. Give me a fresh understanding of what you've done for me. Touch me again. Show me your grace so that I can be shaped and transformed. That's the way around it needs to work. God needs to do a work in you before you can do anything in response to it. But once that's happened, what are some of the evidences of love? What are some of the evidences of us being a loving community? Somewhere else, in Colossians chapter 3, Paul writes this: as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. Notice, by the way, that this passage also starts with God's initiative. As God's chosen ones. Paul then goes on to give 14 different commands, 14 different instructions of how they're to live, but it all starts with God has chosen you. God has called you as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. Clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another. And if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in the one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Teach and admonish one another in all wisdom. And with gratitude in your hearts, sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. I think that's what love looks like. There's this, right in the middle of it, there's these words, above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And surrounding it is all these different aspects of what a loving life looks like. Some of it is love directed towards God, singing psalms, hymns, songs towards God, letting God's word dwell in us richly. But some of it is directed very much towards other people. If you've got a complaint against someone, forgive them. You've been forgiven, so forgive them. Be compassionate, be kind, be humble, be meek, be patient. Those all sound lovely. What about this? Teach and admonish one another. Admonish. Call people out on things. Good old-fashioned rebuke. Speaking the truth in love, we sometimes call it. There's a danger that sometimes we speak the truth in love, but actually the love's not there. The solution to that isn't to stop speaking the truth. Maybe it is for a little bit. But in the long run, the solution to actually not having much love in our truth is to ask God to fill us with love for that person, so that when we speak truth to them, it is done with love. This is what love looks like. When Paul says, above all, clothe yourselves with love, one way to read that would be, here are a bunch of good things to do, Forgiving one another, admonishing one another, all of those sorts of things about how we relate to one another, those are all good. But the most important thing is to love one another. So if one of those things is not compatible with loving someone, then don't do those things, just do the loving them. That's one way to read it. So above all those things, before all of those things, maybe we'll get to those things, but they're not necessarily important. Above all of that, just love people. That's not what Paul is saying. What Paul is saying is that all of those things are acts of love. It's the difference between saying, okay, I can put a t-shirt on and I can put a jumper on, but actually the most important thing is a coat. So I guess I'm going to have to take the t-shirt off and the jumper off so that I can wear the coat. No, the coat goes over all of the rest of it. All of those other things need to be shaped by love. When we forgive people, we can do it for many different reasons. We can do it because it feels good for us. That's true. Forgiveness does lighten a load often. We can do it because we know we should. Okay. But actually, why not be motivated by love? And when we're finding it so hard to forgive someone, so difficult to let that thing go, some of you might be in that place right now, knowing there's someone who you're still holding in that place of unforgiveness, who you haven't let it go. The only way to find that forgiveness isn't to try and muster it up and try harder. The only way is to know more that you are loved, that you have been forgiven, that God has acted towards you with grace. And then that debt of love flows out in forgiving whoever it is we need to forgive. When we teach and admonish one another, when we instruct one another, when we maybe do have to say difficult things to one another, speak hard truths to one another. I'm so grateful for some of the people in my life who've done that, who've had the courage to say, Dave, you really need to think about what you're doing. Or Dave, I really don't think you've got that right. Or Dave, please stop what it is that you're doing because you're heading in a dangerous direction. I'm so glad for the people who've done that. But I'm so glad more for the fact that they've done it in a way that shows they love me. Because you can tell. Sometimes you can feel, sometimes it can seem as though you're banging your head against a brick wall, trying to help someone see the error of their ways. And actually, we've just got frustrated and angry with them. We're no longer doing it because we love them. We're doing it to prove a point. We're doing it because we want to be seen as right. We correct people's theology or doctrine. Loads of people from Bible college here today. That's fantastic. Don't ever lose love and grace when you're talking about the finer points of Calvinism, or when you're talking about different doctrinal things that might separate you. Don't forget that you are people who God has forgiven and he's accepted and he loves. Love one another in and through those conversations. Don't not have them. They're great, they're important, they can even be fun. Have them, but have them with love. When we relate to children or to parents or to colleagues, that person who really does our nut in, when we're relating to that person, talking to that person, how do we find love for them? Well, we could try and write a list of all of their redeeming features. That might help. We could try and think, well, I suppose I should be nice to them. We can try and think, I should be setting an example for others. We can try and think, well, if I'm not kind to them, people won't think Christians are kind. None of that's going to work. The only thing that's going to help you to love someone who's hard to love is to recognize that God loved you when you were hard to love. That he acted with you towards grace. So, love has to come from the inside. It's a character thing. Which is why I actually don't want us to start as we respond to what God's saying, to think about the situations you're in. Maybe it'll be helpful for you to think about the areas where you know love is hard, where you know that loving someone is difficult. But just for a moment, could I encourage you, as I ask the band to come back up, could I encourage you just to put those things to one side, just for a moment? Because the solution to those areas where love is difficult, where being loving is hard, the solution to that isn't to focus in on those issues, isn't to focus in on those situations. The solution to that is to focus again on God's grace. To remember what he's done in your heart and in your life. Then, maybe we'll ask God to move in certain situations and we'll ask people to pray with us. But for now, I just want to draw your attention again to what it is that God has done. I'm going to ask the band to sing the first verse and chorus of a song over us. It's a song that we're familiar with here. It talks about being unraveled by God, being unraveled by his melody over our life. A melody that speaks of freedom, a melody that speaks of chains being broken, of no longer being slaves, of being children of God. That's what God's done in your life. Just for a moment, park those things that you know you might need to think about and deal with and pray about. Just park them for a moment and instead let God remind you. Let him unravel you again.